So this is Sancho's session. Now Sancho's I've always been a huge fan of because Sancho does so much work that puts in the prerequisites for Power Platform makers. Sancho I know well and absolutely adore hearing the technical content.
Quick intro to me. I develop Power Platform and other solutions. I've been for quite a long time now a super user on the PowerApps community forums. I'm one of the PowerApps champs and I am a Microsoft MVP. If you want to look for me on social media, at @Iam_mancat. So if any of you have seen my previous talks on templates, these things hook together quite nicely, but this one's going to be focusing more around accessibility. So the problem is, I think because we have so little time as a community and we spend so much time doing all this templating and making everything look good and branding our apps, and we tend to forget a lot about the accessibility side. I've seen it in many examples, and it's not too complicated to do. It's actually just a little bit extra time, but the advantages are both for the people who need the accessibility and the ones who are just using your app generally. So when you're branding your app, I mean, this was 2 years ago I wrote this slide, but it's still applicable now. There are over 2.5 million app developers. If we're all spending at least an hour, collectively we've spent 13,000 years just branding apps. That's crazy. It had to be a better way, so I built this template, shared it out to the community for everyone to use, modify, etc. So let's jump right into the app because I want to explain about, let's make that more accessible. So there we go. So there, I'm going to explain about accessibility by showing you what not to do. So let's bring this app up. So this screen is a mess, and I'll explain all the different things that we could have potentially done better in here. So one of the things with accessibility is your contrast between your light and your dark, so your backgrounds and your foregrounds, and this has to be within a certain ratio to meet the WCAG, Web Content and Accessibility Guidelines. And at a glance, I can now already see that this, that's a pale gray on a slightly brighter red. It's not a good ratio of contrast. It's difficult to see. The text size itself is small, and that's all very well if you've got a massive screen, but if you happen to be pulling this up on a small tablet, that will be barely readable. Then using that same concept of the contrast between foreground and background, it's not just bright versus dark. Sometimes it's just that they're too similar. And additionally, we want to look at the fact that with color blindness, you might create something that is almost impossible for someone to actually use, because for them, they might be the most common color blindness, red, green. You could make this, and those two colors effectively look like the same color for them. And we can test this using the color blindness simulator. There's a lot of them online, but the one I will point to now is the color blindness simulator called Bliss, and I've got links to it later, don't worry. And effectively what you can do is look at a normal picture. So let's say I take a quick screenshot of this and paste it in here. Or actually take a screenshot. And we can simulate different types of color blindness by cycling through these different values. And let's just zoom in a bit here. So we can see with red weak, green weak, let's go blue blind. And so some of these buttons become almost impossible to use. So I'll put links to that later. And okay, so then there's this really big thing I want to mention, and that is around making things accessible for people who use a keyboard. Not everyone is going to be using a mouse and navigating it as a visible Power App. There's a lot of people out there who have low vision or issues with their sight, and they will most likely be using a screen reader to read things. And PowerApps does its best to make almost every control accessible to screen readers. The problem being, of course, that if you try use a control for something it's not really intended, although kind of is, then you can run into issues. So, for example, the HTML text control, this panel over here is an HTML background with a drop shadow down the sides of it. So if I just go pull that in there, it's got a div with some basic settings and then a box shadow on the bottom and on the right. Now that's all very well and it looks good and everyone loves drop shadows, but the problem will be if we open up narrator. So let me just actually switch to sharing with computer audio. Okay.
Narrator dialog. OK. Button. Alt and O.
Okay.
I am _mancat template app v3. Power apps and 5 more pages. Accessibility. Fail. Screen of type screen. Authoring canvas. Navigate back. Button.
Okay, so I've got that navigate back button, part of this header component I've put together. That's another thing to mention is when you're building components, accessible labels, accessible hint text, you need to put those in there, because if you build a component...
File warning. Press Ctrl and J to go to downloads.
Multiple other
Navigate to settings menu. Button. Navigate to theme settings screen.
Then you want to make sure that someone who's using a keyboard can use it. So if I try cycle through to the
Close
next option,
preview mode. Tab bar. Tab
or
action.
even
Authoring canvas. App bar.
back
Settings.
view.
Authoring. View month. Start. App bar. Authoring
Actually cycle
canvas.
through
Start
the,
month. Jump list for narrator heading left. Exiting narrator.
There we go. And try and understand that someone, I know that might be frustrating, that sound of the narrator for some people, but some people rely on this that's how they navigate life and the computer. So we really have to be considerate and understanding of how they will be affected by the way we've developed an app. So HTML text, the HTML text control, if you look at the bottom here, it does not have a tab index because it can't be tabbed into. And anything that can't be tabbed into, the screen reader is just going to skip over and they'll never see it. So we really need to be careful about not using the HTML text to display critical information. So in this case, I've put a message here that do not choose start month-end process until the 28th of each month. But the person using the keyboard, when they cycle through, they're not going to know that. So they'll just see first button, start month-end, and have no reason not to press it because the warning is not accessible to them. So it's very important not to use HTML text for any kind of critical information. You can use it as a background to get, and I know people love the additional effects you can do with a HTML text control, because obviously you can then embed and create complicated HTML structure. But what you can do is actually then just overlay something else onto it. So in this case, first of all, we're going to fix the contrast ratio here. So this contrast ratio between that hex color and the text hex color, white, if we use the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines for contrast checking, we can actually check the values and make sure that they meet accessibility. So looking at that box we had over here, that doesn't meet any of the guidelines. The green text below it, the green button below it, again, doesn't meet any of the guidelines. And we can quite easily just drop the contrast. Increase the contrast by dropping the lightness of the background color until it matches a passing value. Then take that and update our app with color. There we go. Now it's nice and easy to see. So what I've done here is there's an HTML background and then a button with the same rounded edges that the HTML piece had overlaid exactly over it. And then, so what it effectively does is the background uses relative positioning to the button. So if I look at the properties here, I've got HTML and then I use and that button's width -2, button's height -2, and effectively if I now change the size of this button, the HTML text does itself accordingly. So font size, we talked about that earlier. In this case, obviously we don't want this to be an HTML text, but we want the font size to be bigger. So I'm going to up that to 25, maybe make the text color white. 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, still not perfectly accessible, but we're getting in the right direction. Now, there's a few other things I wanted to mention, and that was around what different ways people use to display things and how that can affect what is accessible. So these 3 items here are all usable as buttons and do different things. But what I've actually done here and what I've seen other people do, this one is a button. This one is a label being used as a button, and this one is an image being used as a button. And if I go back in here and open up Narrator again.
Narrator dialog. I am accessibility, fail, screen of type screen, start month end, button.
So start month end, that's a button, it treats it as button.
View monthly invoices, button.
View
This is
monthly
an
invoices,
image.
treats it as
File
button.
warning. Press Ctrl and J to go to downloads. I am authoring. I am alert.
So
Jump narrator heading level 1. Exiting narrator.
So what is worth knowing is that when labels and images have an on select, so I figured this out by digging into the actual code of the .msapp file. When you create an on select, what it's actually doing is just overlaying a button on top of that item. You can't see it, but that's effectively what it does. So when you do a screen reader on that, it's going to say that that is a button, as we demoed now. So let me make these invisible for a second and just focus on this. Go on, Kitty. Okay, so again, looking at what someone who uses a screen reader might or might not see. If I have a label here with a tab index of -1, which is the default for labels because you're not supposed to tab through them and type things into them. But if I have something in it that has a bit of information that maybe someone would need to know, such as please enter only your last name, and I enter in a full name and that invalidates some or other thing, I need to at least make sure that that is set to a tab index of 0 so that it can be tabbed through and read by a screen reader. Additionally, just highlighting again on this topic of don't put things in an HTML text that the user will not know about. So in terms of accessibility, this lack of signature confirmation, because it's only an HTML text with a bit of text inside it, it's not actually a HTML with something else overlaid on top of it. You can't tab into that. A screen reader is not going to see that, and I'm going to go back into Narrator and show that again.
Narrator dialog. Press Ctrl and Enter key or F2 key to exit formula bar text editing area. On touch devices, you can swipe to leave this control. 93% sign. Accessibility, fail, screen of type screen, file warning. Press Ctrl and J to go to downloads. Agree to terms checkbox unchecked.
So
Enter your name selected. Edit, enter your name selected.
So as far as the accessibility screen reader is concerned, it just says enter your name. It doesn't say any other further details.
Clear value.
Clear
Button.
value.
Agree to terms
Agree to
checkbox
terms,
unchecked.
but they won't
File
know what
warning.
the terms are
Press
because
Ctrl and J to go to downloads. Enter your names. Submit timesheet.
Okay.
Agree to terms checkbox. Submit timesheet button.
So if you saw that now, you can't
Narrator heading. Exiting narrator.
you can't actually tab into a pen input. So someone who's not, just try and think for a second, if you had to use a keyboard with your eyes closed and navigate this, how in the world would you be able to do that if half the things are designed to fight against you? So this checkbox, confirm terms. What terms? You don't know because they can't be checked. The terms happen to say that a lack of signature would indicate you waive all rights to your remuneration, which is terrible. But the even worse part, and Microsoft, if you're listening, the pen input can't be tabbed into, which makes sense, except there should be a functionality where you can tab into a pen input, type in some text, and it will overlay there as an override has happened on a text basis. But I think the worst part of this is that the pen input has an accessible label, which will never ever reach the light of day because the screen reader can't tab into it. So these are some of the core things I think that I see people make mistakes on very commonly, and that I wanted to just highlight on is accessible labels on everything. Wherever possible, just pop in an accessible label. If it's something that, for example, this icon, I've got no tooltip on it. The tooltip will be read out if you tab into it using a screen reader. So I could say, okay, this one doesn't need to be tabbed into, but like indicator of correct submission. And then when it gets tabbed into by the screen reader, that will be read out. But one thing I wanted to really positively highlight then on, again, Microsoft, is when I last gave a similar talk, when you tried to tab between buttons and you didn't have a tooltip or an accessible label for the button, it would just say button, 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 button. But it's actually, they fixed that now, and it by default now will read out the text on your button every time you tab into it with a screen reader, which is great. So yes, it's really difficult to do a lot of the accessibility things if you think about how much time it takes, but if you do it as you're going through, it's a lot quicker. Additionally, you want to be using the app checker here and check the accessibility tab, because missing tab stop, again, that's going to be what is able to be tabbed in and what will be read out by a screen reader. It's very key to check that. Missing accessible labels, this might not always be applicable because the thing that is missing an accessible label might not be able to be tabbed into and is not going to be read out or known or dealt with. And focus is not showing. That depends on whether you actually want the button to be showing as focused or not. So going back here, so when you're building it in terms, we mentioned earlier about the contrast between light and dark. That is kind of why, part of the reason why I built this template is to make it really, really, really easy for you to actually just enable that for your users. You might say, okay, well, we don't want to have time to set up all these colors and contrast. And well, if you use this template I built, which, by the way, this is the new version I'm going to be releasing this Saturday. It's the first time I've shown it publicly. If you use this, I have a theme palette that you can use to then pick out your accessible monochrome colors. So you could get rid of the other themes, just leave these two monochrome themes to instantly enable accessibility for your users. You send them over here and they can just pick, okay, I want that theme, I'm going to set it. And the app should, that's needs some fixing, then be black and white, except where you have overridden it. So there are points where I have specified static colors and not colors on a theme. So if I look at the app on start here, these colors are what define the basics of everything else, and how they are then dealt with in terms of making them accessible, because really what it should be is you should be able to just, let's go and should be able to just pop in a few items. And that should be it. You shouldn't have to then set all the, what will be hundreds and hundreds of properties for color, fill, hover, disabled, everything. You should just be, I've created all those items, go into my theme palette, set the theme, and there we go, they're done. And additionally, things like pen input are dealt with. So one thing that came up a lot when I first released this was people didn't want to just stick to the 3-tier coloring I'd set up. So I finally figured out a way to override on an individual control level. So if you want the craziest theme you can think of, you can certainly do that. And that includes things like the date picker, which the default date picker can be, a lot can be done to it. It turns out it's not just the coloring, but the font, the highlight, the headers, your pen, you can deal with the background, you can deal with fonts. And this then also applies, because I know what people are thinking, and again, question always asked, what happens about forms? Well, if I, let's say I insert a edit form here, I've got this funky theme selected, and I'm just going to populate it with some data. And so, yeah, as it turns out, you can actually affect the default everywhere. And that can be things like the title card. These are text inputs. And if I go look at the color values for these, we now have control level overrides. So if you wanted to make your company's perfect theme once and then push it out for as a base template for clients or yourself or your internal colleagues to use, you can do that now. Because we have your basic theme, then we have your additional font sizes, and then we have the controls theme, which is really long, but it does allow you to then change every aspect, every label, button, drop down, combo. But you might be thinking, well, I don't want to change all of that. Well, that's fine. You can leave it as I've set it up here. And then if we go down to the themes, so you have like the basic theme, which is the one that loads on startup. And then we have a control level where I have overridden specific properties. So I might want to, let's get the text input fill. I'll just copy that row, pop that in here, and give that a random color. And let's just get on start running to set that variable, pick it up in here. We can see there that this, in the example screen, that this is now changed to fuchsia in the background. If I set that theme and go back here Done. So overrides on an individual level, it could be, I've done font size, backgrounds, colors, really anything. There's a lot more you can do, but there's some stuff you can't. So it's mostly the design properties that you can template like this. But doing that, you can then easily have accessibility within the app. So let's go back to a default theme. So something I'm working on at the moment that should be done by the weekend is automatic text resizing, because this is a serious, Microsoft, are you listening? This is a serious thing that is missing from the live play of an app. On the user side, if you've built an app that has these tiny little labels, because on your screen, you've got a massive screen and those labels look perfectly fine, someone who has accessibility needs might actually need those to be a lot larger. And there's no really easy way to do that for the app that's running. Except, fingers crossed this works, except, there we go. Now you have the ability to affect the font while the app is running. And that's everywhere. So if I even go back to this screen that we set up a few minutes ago, that's now, I mean, it'll take a bit of adjusting for some of the controls, because obviously toggles have a default width that they're set to in forms. But the idea is solid. It's now changed the size of all the fonts, and that will make it a lot easier for accessibility wise for people, and it stops you from having to then come up with some crazy way of doing it. I've just narrowed it down to this. I'm going to turn into a part of the title bar, and you'll just be able to click up, down, and live increase or decrease your font size on any running app that's based on this template. So that's crazy and new and accessible, because this is like the core reason I built all of this is to, well, one, to save time, but two, because there's stuff missing from the IDE, from the development environment, from the user experience that should be there by default, but sometimes people like me or other people have to make it easier for everyone else. So, yeah, that's the majority of the accessibility items I wanted to show there are around that, is thinking about the size of your text, the contrast ratio of background to foreground. Don't use HTML text as a critical component, use it as a backdrop for other things. Choose the size of your controls. Don't use pen input if you have for a hard requirement, or necessarily you have to wait for Microsoft to update it. But let's say so because I've got the dynamic sizing of all the items, this should have increased the pen size, but I think I did that statically. But you could effectively change almost everything in the app. We've got adding and removing of themes for accessibility, and for your general case, add your company colors here, do any overrides in the controls theme section if you want it as the base override. So when the app loads, it's going to look like X, then that goes in this list, assuming you don't like the way I've set it up. This also applies to the new screen functionality. So if I go and create a new list screen and go pop another template theme on, that automatically is now set, because I've edited the code in the back of the MS app file, the themes.json file, to default all of these new screen items to some of these weird labels names that Microsoft gave, such as inverted background header label color, which is really long-winded, but it's the background header label on new screens when the background is inverted. I've got a few examples here of sort of layouts you can use for your apps. Nothing too fancy. I'm going to put a few more in there now, and ways to do highly contrasted accessible menus that then are functional and do what they need to do. So really it's just being mindful of what someone might need to do for this app, and not just building things because they look good, but making them accessible and functional for everyone from the get-go. Don't do it as an afterthought, because by highly contrasting these screens, for example, and these icons, if you do that as a default, so let's run my own start again. So even here in the default theme, they are highly contrasted, and it's been shown that when a user is interacting with an app or any kind of screen, you're able to discern options and distinguish between items massively faster if the contrast ratio is high enough. So it's not just that it makes it easier and more accessible for everyone who needs accessibility needs, but it actually increases, well, it makes it easy for your apps to look good, and it will increase the speed with which people navigate through your app, because there's a lot less executive function needed when they are so highly contrasted. So yeah, new forms. This is a big one. I know there's obviously lots of form options out there. If you follow @O365 on Twitter, he's just recently released a form builder. If you look at Clarissa's blog, Clarissa Gillingham's made a form replacement, Infinity Forms, that uses galleries instead of static cards like this. But in my case, I wanted to build things that even the new makers who are just getting started with the technology can just insert, like we did. We inserted a new form, we just chose a data source, pre-populated, and immediately if I go and set a dark theme and go back to that screen, that's done. And that's how it should be. Your early makers who haven't spent months, years, however long building apps, they shouldn't have to fuss around with all the different properties and try to figure out what colors would be best and how it's all going to work. So I wanted to really speed that whole process up, technically just wipe it out, don't have to do it anymore, and help people get into the building experience faster without having to worry so much about how everything's set up. So if I go and, so like your pen inputs, when you move into a dark theme, the pen input color, you can override that. So if I want, let's say I look at this override, and I want the pen input color to be purple. I can look at pen input ink color, take that down to my theme, and just pop that in here, and I want it to be purple. And let's recollect that. Just set that theme. Where were we? Screen. Yeah. That's better. Purple there. And there we go. Right, sorry, I didn't click the set, didn't choose the theme before setting it. So there, now we've got a purple text input just by overriding it at the control level for that particular theme. And you'll notice here, because we've overridden the default label font type to Great Vibes, your default label is in a cursive font. And because we used that label for our font in the increase or decrease, we've now increase and decrease there. So some work still to be done on this. I'll sort that out before the weekend, as it's overriding the theme currently, but small issue. The idea being you have now absolute control without having to manually set up your own, and I know everyone does, a lot of people do this, they set up a screen full of controls that they can copy from to paste elsewhere where everything's already preset, which I think, again, still requires you to set all of that up, and it's a bit of a hassle, and people change it accidentally. So this will allow you to build things a lot faster. If you have clients that use specific colors and themes or want, so for example, I don't know if anyone noticed, but I actually set the default for most things to have rounded edges. That's not always the default. But if, let's say you had a client who needed their buttons to be a red background with blue border color. Previously, wouldn't have been able to do that very easily, but now I can just override for this particular theme, red background on buttons, blue border color. And that's really just as easy as going down to button fill, pop it in a theme, and we want to do red. Run that on start again. There we go. And if I set this theme now, that should have affected my buttons everywhere in the app. So this is something you couldn't do before. Before I was just sort of limiting people to choosing 3 colors, which made it very simple to set up, but it also limited how much you could really use it for clients or for your internal company, because not everyone uses just 3 colors and has everything set up based on that. So really quick to set up, instant accessibility. The one on this version 3 that I'm going to be releasing this weekend now also has accessibility in terms of text size. It has instant overrides on theming. You can set up it really quickly. And so things to remember: don't use HTML text for anything other than a background. It's not accessible. Don't use pen input as a required item, because you can't use pen input from a keyboard. That makes sense because currently it's not set up that way. There should be, and again, I'm not trying to be too harsh, but there should be an option here that if you tab into pen input, you should be able to type and it will override that. So hopefully that gets sorted at some point. So yeah, actually, I think I'm gonna pause there now, because I'm sure, let me just take a look at the chat. Questions?
Yeah, we do have one about responsiveness and resizing there from Bill.
Responsiveness. Is it a problem with resizing? No. No, it's not. If the problem is, if you have not set things like auto height, and you make the font past a certain, increase it past a certain size, obviously the label is going to stay the same height and not be affected. So that's one thing. Then let me go back to, yeah. So since people are asking, link to contrast checker, bit.ly/WCAG checker, link to color blindness simulator, bit.ly/colblindsim. And link to my current template, which will refresh to the new one this weekend, bit.ly/brand template v2. How can we get access to this? Douglas, if you follow this link here, you can get access to it. It's available for free to everyone on the PowerApps community forums. Have I written accessibility guidance we can reference? It's in progress. Based on these talks I've been given on accessibility, it's a work in progress. So the responsiveness it depends what the control is. Obviously, some controls are better than others. By default, most of the controls, which I know a lot of you override this, so maybe I'll just shout that out right now. Most of the controls, when you look at them, their height is based on size times like 1.8. so that as the size, text font size increases, so does your control size. So worth remembering that. And
I think you've covered everything, Sancho.
Get it. Thank you. So, what do I want you to do? Try build things accessibility-wise by default. Add accessible labels wherever you can. A lot of the times with accessible labels, I'm not going to call this as a default and don't say do this all the time, but you can actually reference that object.text as your accessible label. Not always applicable if you've got a massive mountain of text on it, because then obviously the screen reader is going to read through all of that. Use well contrasted colors, larger fonts wherever possible, or have the option to turn that on or off, and ability to have black and white high contrast themes to not have to deal with, to make it more accessible for those who have vision issues or are colorblind or anything like that. And yeah, just be mindful of how everyone else who you don't know is going to be using that app. Any other questions?
I think there was one about how many cats you have, Sancho.
I have 2 cats, Wilbur and Webster. I don't know if you heard them, but it's dinner time, so.
And also, can you share the contrast checker website link, please? We'll get Sancho to pop them in chat for us.
I will paste all the links in the chat shortly.
Perfect. And we'll also put them below the video when it appears on YouTube as well. So thank you very much, Sancho. I mean, that was just awesome. It's not only have you pointed out the problem, but you've also given us a solution. How about that? Absolutely brilliant. Superhero, nice. I do like it when things are well received. So well done. Oh, there goes my cat. Well done on sharing with us everything, the problems and the solutions. I was very impressed with the reader. She had such a lovely voice. She was very chatty.
Susan.
Normally it's quite an automated sound, isn't it? But it was actually like the voices are getting so much better. Really enjoyed that. And I think that was really useful to I was going to say see it from other people's perspectives, but maybe see it, hear it, learn people's perspectives. So, and accessibility is a huge thing. It doesn't matter which organization you're in. Thinking about the humanity as a whole is really important. Yeah, you shouldn't have a user that can't use your app, but it's so always an afterthought, isn't it? Do you know what I mean? So I think that whole message of build it in at the beginning, really key.
I mean, from my perspective, accessible labels and those should be required fields. Just saying.
Love it, absolutely love it.